Hey everybody, welcome to yet another Snowrunner tutorial. Somebody was asking me about IK and how to set it up and maybe a brief explanation as to what it is and why we need it. So I figured what the heck, we'll do another video based on what that is and try to try to go into a little bit of an explanation as to what it does, what it's for, and why it's not 100% important to a truck build, but in certain applications you really need to actually use it. So here I have a chassis for a truck that I've been working on, and I set up one shock with an IK setup. IK stands for inverse kinetics. Um, I I can fully admit I don't 100% fully know all the ins and outs of IK. However, I do know how to set it up in terms of how to use it in Snowrunner. Typically, what IK does is it links one bone to another bone and causes bone A to follow bone B in certain ways based on how the XML is programmed to handle that IK. So let's hide my collision mesh right there, my CDT, and you can see I have two bones set up here covering up the rear shock. So I have the other rear shock that I didn't do an IK on. I just did normal bone weighting and weighted it to the rear axle and the frame. This one I'm using an IK setup. That way there I can show you what happens when you don't do that versus when you do that. So I have the game set up here with this same chassis, and we have a very broken shock on the right side and a nice straight shock on the left side. And that's because this one is using inverse kinetics, whereas this one is using very simple bone weighting. So what's happening here is the top half of the shock is weighted to the frame, so it stays with the frame. The bottom half is weighted to the axle, it stays with the axle. The middle section, it gets stretched out because it's trying to bridge the gap between the two. You could have the stretch at the very bottom, you could have the stretch at the very top. No matter where you put it, it's not going to look that great. So what we do is we use inverse kinetics, and that allows the stretch to happen more naturally. This setup is obviously very extreme, and I did that on purpose so it better illustrates how inverse kinetics work visually. Let's change this back to that way there we get the full day cycle and we don't get really dark out. I can set this back to a normal height and you can see it still looks okay. And this shock isn't the worst, but it's not the greatest either. So how do we set up an IK setup like this? How do I go about setting up an IK setup? Again, my methods aren't always the best. They're not always 100% correct even. However, they're functional. So that's what I go with because it works. It may not be the best way to do it. It may not even be the most correct way to do it, but it's what works. At least works for me. So the way I set these up is first thing we're going to do is you'll notice I have the root node in the rear axle. What I like to do, we'll just delete these. That way we can start fresh. So we have no vertex groups. We're going to come in and we are going to select this ring because it's the most centered of the top of the shock, and it's kind of where I want the first bone to be situated. So I'll use Shift S and snap my cursor to selected. So now it puts the 3D cursor there. We're going to go into edit mode on the armature, and I'm going to Shift A to add a bone, and it adds the bone wherever the 3D cursor is. So now I have that bone set up exactly at the top of the shock, right where I need it to be. We're going to come into the shock again. We're going to zoom in down here. And we're going to select this bottom section. Again, Shift S, cursor to selected. We're going to snap that cursor down there. We're going to go back up, select this top of the bone, Shift S, selection to cursor. So now this bone is following the shock perfectly. There's no guesswork. There's nothing else we need to do. I'm going to Shift A and add another bone. Now it's at the bottom. And this is a real quick, easy cheat. Shift S, cursor to selected, back up, pick this top one, Shift S, selection to cursor. So now I have two bones. They're perfectly in line with each other and perfectly in line with that shock. And I did that same method over here. So what I'm going to do is take the bottom shock, or the bottom bone, and this is going to be, this is my right rear shock bottom. And I've been labeling my IK bones in the same method for every truck for, I can't even count how many different mods now. And the reason why I do it the same every time is that way there it's consistent, and if I have to go back into an older mod, I know what I'm looking at. They're all the same, they're all labeled the same, so it makes it easy to troubleshoot because I can just say, oh, that's what that is, and I'm not getting confused with old trucks and old mods and things. So this one is the top. So this is my right rear shock top. That's the top bone. So the way that these get parented now is the bottom bone gets parented to the top bone. So you pick the child first, then the parent. Parent, make, keep offset. And then this top bone gets parented to the root. So parent, make, keep offset. So that sets up our bone situation. We can hide this armature now. In fact, we can localize this. It'll just make it a little easier to see for weighting things. So I'm going to go into vertex select. We're going to pick all of this top. We need this inside ring. We need this inside ring. And then we just need these. So we're just going to come through and pick everything that goes to that top section. That's not one. Just try to pick everything that goes up there. Okay, that's the entire top section. We missed. Oops. I'm holding the wrong button. Okay. So we are going to create a new vertex group. We're going to call this bone right rear shock top. And we're going to assign that. And then to make selections easier, we're going to invert, and that selects all the bottom. I'm going to create a new bone right rear shock bottom and assign that. Come out of here, and now we need to take that shock, the shock, and parent with armature deform. So now we can and then export FBX. We're already set up. Export. Come back into the game. Convert it. Close. And because I haven't done any programming on the XML side, none of that IK is actually working at the moment. So what we need to do is come into the XML programming, and underneath game data, so you have all your sockets and whatnot, your camera positions, then your sockets, then the end tag of game data. After that, we need to create a section called automatic IK. Some of the vanilla trucks have this already. For me, I've been copying because I use the same setup on all my scout trucks and even some of the semi trucks. I have these pretty much just copy, cut, and paste. So because I'd already done that one rear shock as a demo at the beginning, I already had the code in here. So let me explain what all this code does. So first, it's saying that there's an IK bone. The model frame is the first bone that it's attaching to. So model frame, bone, left rear, shock, top. Then the parent frame that that bone connects to is the root node, because that's where your frame is. So this is the top, so the top part of that shock. In fact, we'll come back in here. So that top part is connected to the frame. So we want to make sure parent frame equals root node. IK joint, this is explaining what is happening with this bone compared to the parent. So axis local is where it's moving. Type equals hinge 2. So that's telling it that this top part where the bone is a hinge. So this is only going to rotate. That's the only movement. It's kind of like a constraint. It's the only movement that's allowed to happen is going to be a hinge. So then we're telling it nested inside is another IK bone. Attached to frame, attached to the rear axle. So we want to attach the bone to the rear axle. And the model frame is the left rear shock bottom. So we want to attach this bottom to the axle. So now this bone is stuck to that axle, and rather than parenting it within Blender, we can do it this way via the XML. Again, we're going to limit its action with the IK joint, and the type equals slider. So this is forced to only slide up and down. It can't do any other movements, it only slides up and down. But because these are nested together, and because the lower bone is parented to the top bone, it's also forced to follow the angle of the top bone. So the top bone dictates the swing, how it swings front to back, and the bottom bone dictates the sliding motion in and out as it compresses and expands. And that's what gives you that motion in here. So let's actually, we need to create this now for the second one. So I'm just going to copy all that, paste it, and I know I need to go with my right rear and right rear, and we're going to save it, and then we reload the game. And we will install this suspension just to lift it up. And now you can see, compared to what it was before, it's fixed. So that is inverse kinetics, down and dirty, real fast, done in real time. That's the basics of what you need to make a shock look fairly correct within Snowrunner. Granted, it's stretched out way beyond what it would ever do, but at least it's not bending and broken in the middle. And again, in a normal setting, that looks fairly correct. That's about how they should look. Lift it up a little bit. Again, pretty much how it should look. So I hope that helps, and hope you guys have a good one, and maybe I'll be back for another video sometime in the future. Thanks.